The crack of a gunshot split the dawn air as Eleanor Zimmer clutched her hastily packed carpet bag and sprinted across the dry Nevada soil, her wedding dress catching on sagebrush and tearing at the hem. Behind her, she could hear her father's enraged shouts growing fainter as she put distance between herself and the ranch house where, in just hours, she was supposed to marry Harold Whitcomb, a man 3 times her age with cold eyes and a reputation that made her skin crawl. It was 1876, and at 20 years old, Eleanor had decided she would rather face the wilderness than a lifetime shackled to a man who saw her as little more than property to be acquired. Her father's gambling debts had sealed her fate, or so he thought. Eleanor had other plans. She paused behind a large boulder, her lungs burning as she tried to catch her breath. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Had they caught up to her already? Peering cautiously around the rock, she saw a lone rider approaching from the north, not from the direction of her father's ranch. The man rode tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. He wasn't one of her father's men, but that didn't mean he wouldn't return her for a reward. As he drew closer, she could make out his features, strong jaw darkened with stubble, intense eyes scanning the terrain, and a worn cowboy hat pulled low over his brow. Eleanor ducked back behind the boulder, heart pounding. She needed to stay hidden until he passed. But as fate would have it, a rattlesnake had the same idea about using the boulder for shelter. Its warning rattle sent her scrambling backward with a startled cry. The rider's head snapped in her direction. In an instant, he'd drawn his revolver and dispatched the snake with a single shot. "You all right, miss?" His voice was deep, with a hint of a southern drawl. Eleanor stood frozen, torn between fear of this stranger and the knowledge that her father and Harold's men couldn't be far behind. The decision was made for her when distant shouts carried on the wind. The cowboy's eyes narrowed as he took in her torn wedding dress and the panic in her eyes. "You running from something?" "Someone," she corrected, finding her voice. "Please, they'll force me to marry a monster if they catch me." He studied her for a long moment, then holstered his gun and extended his hand. "Name's Brody Mitchell. I reckon I've got no love for forced marriages." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking his offered hand. With surprising strength, he pulled her up behind him on his chestnut stallion. "Hold tight," he instructed, just as the sound of pursuing horses grew louder. Without waiting for a response, he spurred his horse forward, and they took off across the open desert. Eleanor clung to his waist, her face pressed against his back as they rode hard away from her pursuers. She had just put her life in the hands of a complete stranger, but somehow, it felt like the first right decision she'd made in months. They rode for hours, Brody expertly navigating the rugged terrain, putting distance between them and her pursuers. Eleanor's entire body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she didn't complain. Every mile was another mile of freedom. When they finally stopped to rest in the shadow of a rocky outcropping, Eleanor slid from the horse on trembling legs. Brody dismounted with practiced ease and offered her his canteen. "Thank you," she said, taking a careful sip of the lukewarm water. "I'm Eleanor Zimmer. Pleasure to meet you properly, Miss Zimmer, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He tipped his hat. "Mind telling me who we're running from?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "My father arranged my marriage to Harold Whitcomb to settle his gambling debts. Harold is," she shuddered, "not a good man. There are rumors about what happened to his previous wives." Brody's expression darkened. "Whitcomb, the cattle baron from Carson City." She nodded. "You know him?" "Know of him. None of it good." He scanned the horizon. "We need to keep moving. If Whitcomb's involved, he'll have men searching all over the territory." "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, suddenly realizing she had no plan beyond escape. "I've got a small cabin about a day's ride from here. We can lay low there while we figure out what to do next." He paused. "That is, if you want my help." Eleanor looked at this man, this stranger who had risked himself for her without question. "Yes," she said firmly. "I would be grateful for your help, Mr. Mitchell." "Just Brody," he corrected with the first hint of a smile she'd seen. "If we're going to be on the run together, we might as well be on a first-name basis." They rode through the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and eat some of the jerky Brody carried in his saddlebags. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple, Eleanor found herself studying her rescuer's profile. "What were you doing out here anyway?" she asked. "Before you found me, I mean." Brody was silent for a moment. "I was tracking a small herd of Mustangs. I break horses for a living. Sell them to ranchers, stagecoach companies, sometimes the army." "You're a horse tamer?" Eleanor couldn't keep the interest from her voice. "Some call it that." There was pride in his voice. "I prefer to think of it as coming to an understanding with them. Force doesn't work with horses, not if you want their trust." Eleanor thought about that as they continued riding. "My father always believed force was the answer to everything. Animals, people. It didn't matter. Some men are like that," Brody said quietly. "They never learn their strength and gentleness too." The night grew cold as they continued their journey, the stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the desert. Eleanor found herself leaning closer to Brody's back, drawn to his warmth. "You doing all right back there?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just tired," she admitted. "And cold." Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat while still riding and passed it back to her. The leather was warm from his body and smelled of horse, tobacco, and something uniquely him. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping it around her shoulders. "We'll stop soon," he promised. "There's a small spring ahead with decent cover." True to his word, within the hour they arrived at a sheltered hollow where a small spring bubbled up among rocks. Brody helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Eleanor was acutely aware of how close they stood for that brief moment before he stepped away to tend to his horse. She watched as he cared for the animal, speaking to it in low, soothing tones as he removed the saddle and brushed it down. There was something about the gentle way this strong man handled his horse that made her heart beat a little faster. Brody built a small, sheltered fire, careful to keep it low and hidden. "We should be safe here for the night," he said, settling across from her. "But we'll head out before dawn." Eleanor nodded, staring into the flames. "I've never done anything like this before," she confessed. "Running away, defying my father. Why now?" Brody asked, his eyes reflecting the firelight. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I watched my mother wither away in a loveless marriage. When she died last year, something in me changed. I promised myself I wouldn't share her fate." She paused. "When I overheard Harold talking about how he would tame me once we were married, I knew I had to escape." Brody's jaw tightened. "No one deserves to be tamed like that." "What about you?" Eleanor asked, drawing his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Do you have family?" A shadow passed over his face. "Lost my parents to cholera when I was 16. Been on my own since then." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Worked cattle drives, tried my hand at mining, eventually found my calling with horses." "It sounds lonely," she said softly. His eyes met hers across the fire. "It can be," he admitted. "But there's freedom in it too." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a coyote the only sounds in the night. Eleanor felt her eyelids growing heavy. "Get some sleep," Brody said, noticing her exhaustion. "I'll keep watch." "What about you?" she asked. "I've gone longer without sleep," he assured her. "Rest. Tomorrow will be another long day." Eleanor curled up on the ground, using her carpetbag as a pillow, still wrapped in his coat. Despite the hard earth beneath her and the uncertainty ahead, she felt safer than she had in months. Just before sleep claimed her, she murmured, "Thank you, Brody, for everything." His response was so quiet, she almost missed it. "You're welcome, Eleanor." She woke to Brody gently shaking her shoulder. The sky was still dark, stars fading as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern horizon. "Time to go," he said softly. "I've saddled up and packed everything." Eleanor nodded, quickly splashing cold water from the spring on her face to chase away the last vestiges of sleep. She tried to hand Brody back his coat, but he shook his head. "Keep it for now. That wedding dress won't do you much good out here." She looked down at her once beautiful dress, now torn and dirty. "I have some clothes in my bag." I wasn't completely unprepared for my escape. Brody turned his back, giving her privacy to change behind a large boulder. Eleanor quickly shed the wedding dress and pulled on a simple blouse and skirt. The clothes were plain but practical, purchased in secret over months as she planned her escape. When she emerged, Brody gave her an approving nod. "Much better for riding." They set off as the first rays of sunlight began to streak across the sky. Eleanor found she was growing accustomed to the rhythm of riding, her body learning to move with the horse rather than against it. "How much farther to your cabin?" she asked as they paused to let the horse drink from a small stream. "We should reach it by nightfall if we keep a steady pace," Brody replied, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, noticing his concern. "Dust cloud to the south." He pointed. "Could be nothing, could be riders." Eleanor felt fear clutch at her heart. "Do you think it's them?" "Can't be sure, but we shouldn't take chances." He helped her back onto the horse. "We'll change course, head into rougher country. They'll have a harder time tracking us there." They rode up into the foothills, the terrain becoming steeper and more challenging. Brody's horse navigated the rocky ground with sure footing, but their pace slowed considerably. Eleanor could sense Brody's tension in the set of his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said after a while. "I've brought trouble to your doorstep." He glanced back at her. "Don't apologize. Any man worth his salt would do the same." "I don't think that's true," she replied. "Most would have ridden on by." They crested a ridge, and Brody reined in the horse. Below them stretched a vast panorama of rugged wilderness, golden in the afternoon sun. For a moment, they both sat in silence, taking in the view. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "That it is," Brody agreed. "This is why I stay out here. No matter how hard life gets, there's always this." They continued their journey, winding down the other side of the ridge. As the sun began to set, Eleanor spotted a small structure nestled among pine trees in a protected valley. "Is that your cabin?" she asked. Brody nodded. "It's not much, but it's home." The cabin was indeed small, but solidly built of logs with a stone chimney. A corral stood to one side, currently empty. As they approached, Eleanor noticed a small vegetable garden and a woodpile stacked neatly against the side of the house. Brody dismounted and helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Let me get you settled inside, then I'll take care of the horse," he said. The interior of the cabin was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small table and 2 chairs nearby. A bed stood in one corner, covered with a patchwork quilt. Shelves held books more than Eleanor would have expected and various supplies. "Like I said, it's not much," Brody said, watching her take it all in. "It's wonderful," Eleanor replied honestly. The cabin had a feeling of peace that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Brody nodded, seemingly pleased by her response. "Make yourself at home. I'll be back in a few minutes." While he tended to his horse, Eleanor explored the cabin more thoroughly. The books on the shelves surprised her: poetry by Whitman, novels by Dickens and Cooper, even a volume of Shakespeare. She was running her fingers along the spines when Brody returned. "You like to read," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked almost embarrassed. "Whenever I can. There's not much else to do during the winter months. My mother taught me to love books," Eleanor said softly. They were her escape. Brody nodded in understanding. "Hunger's a powerful thing, but I reckon hunger for knowledge is just as strong." He moved to the fireplace. "I'll get a fire going. Nights get cold up here." As he worked, Eleanor sat at the table, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 2 days. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Brody paused, looking over at her. "That depends on what you want. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. Wickham has no idea where my place is." "And then what?" "I can't hide forever." The fire caught, flames licking at the dry wood. Brody stood and faced her. "Do you have anyone you could go to? Family or friends in another territory?" Eleanor shook her head. "My father made sure I had no one but him. It made me easier to control." Brody's expression hardened briefly before softening again. "Well, then we'll figure something out. I've got connections in California. Once things cool down, maybe we could get you there." The idea of traveling that far alone frightened Eleanor, but she nodded. "Thank you." Brody prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. They ate in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. After dinner, Brody took a blanket from a chest. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor began to protest, but the determined look in his eyes stopped her. "Thank you," she said instead. That night, lying in Brody's bed, surrounded by his scent, Eleanor found her thoughts continuously drifting to the man sleeping just a few feet away. There was something about him, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness that called to her in a way no man ever had before. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee. Brody was already up, cooking breakfast. She watched him for a moment, admiring the way he moved with quiet efficiency. "Good morning," she said, sitting up. He turned, a smile warming his features. "Morning. Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," she admitted. They fell into an easy routine over the next few days. Brody showed Eleanor how to tend the garden and taught her about the local plants and animals. In the evenings, they would read by the fire, sometimes sharing passages from their favorite books. On the fifth day, Brody announced he needed to check his trap lines and replenish their meat supply. "I'll be gone most of the day," he said, strapping on his gun belt. "You'll be safe here, but keep the rifle close just in case." Eleanor nodded, trying not to show her nervousness at being left alone. "I'll be fine." After he left, she busied herself with chores, but the cabin felt empty without his presence. By mid-afternoon, she had cleaned every surface and reorganized his shelves. With nothing left to do, she decided to bake bread using the supplies in his small pantry. The familiar task soothed her, reminding her of happier times with her mother. The cabin filled with the comforting smell of baking bread, and for the first time since her escape, Eleanor felt a sense of home. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the approaching riders until they were nearly at the cabin. Heart pounding, she grabbed the rifle and peered out the window. 3 men on horseback had stopped in the clearing. Even from a distance, she recognized one of them, Thomas Reed, one of her father's hands. Eleanor's mind raced. How had they found her? She checked that the door was barred and positioned herself by the window, rifle ready. She had never fired a gun before, but Brody had shown her the basics, just in case. "Hello, the cabin," one of the men called out. "We're looking for a young woman. Runaway bride. Her father's mighty worried about her." Eleanor remained silent, praying they would leave. Instead, they dismounted and spread out around the cabin. "We know she's here," Thomas called. "Saw a woman's dress hanging on the line yesterday when we was scouting the valley." Eleanor silently cursed herself for being so careless. She had washed her spare clothing and hung it to dry without thinking. "Come on out, Miss Zimmer," Thomas continued. "Your wedding day's been postponed, but Mr. Whitcomb is still waiting for his bride." When she didn't respond, the men conferred briefly, then one approached the door and pounded on it. "Open up, or we're coming in," he shouted. Eleanor's hands trembled on the rifle. "Go away," she finally called. "I'm not going back." The pounding stopped. For a moment, she thought they might leave. Then she heard a thud against the door. They were trying to break it down. She aimed the rifle at the door, heart racing. The sturdy logs held against the first few attempts, but she could see the bar beginning to splinter. Just as the door seemed about to give way, gunshots rang out from the forest edge. The men at the door scattered, diving for cover. "Step away from my cabin," Brody's voice carried across the clearing. Relief washed over Eleanor. She moved to the window and saw Brody positioned behind a large tree, rifle aimed at the intruders. "This ain't your business, mister," Thomas shouted back. "We're just here for the girl." "The lady made her choice," Brody replied, his voice deadly calm. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." One of the men tried to edge toward his horse, but Brody's shot kicked up dirt inches from his feet, freezing him in place. "Next one won't miss," Brody warned. "Now drop your guns and back away." The standoff lasted several tense moments before Thomas finally spoke. "We'll go for now, but this ain't over. Mr. Whitcomb doesn't give up what's his." "I was never his," Eleanor called through the window, finding her courage. "Tell him to forget about me." The men reluctantly mounted their horses and rode away, casting dark glances over their shoulders. Brody remained in position until they were out of sight, then hurried to the cabin. Eleanor unbarred the door and flew into his arms the moment he entered. He held her tightly, his heart pounding against her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling back to look at her face. She nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "They said they saw my clothes on the line yesterday. They've been watching the cabin." Brody's expression darkened. "We need to leave. They'll be back with more men." "Where will we go?" Eleanor asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "I have a friend who owns a ranch near Sacramento. We can head there." He looked around the cabin. "Pack only what you need. We'll leave at first light." They spent the evening preparing for their journey. Brody plotted their route on a worn map, showing Eleanor the path they would take through the mountains. "It won't be easy terrain," he warned, "but it's our best chance of losing anyone who follows." Eleanor nodded, determined. "I can handle it." As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushed, sending jolts of awareness through Eleanor. She found herself watching Brody when he wasn't looking, admiring the strong lines of his profile and the gentleness in his hands. That night, as they sat by the fire eating what might be their last meal in the cabin for a long time, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why are you doing all this for me? You could have dropped me in the nearest town and been done with it." Brody was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "My sister was forced into a marriage like the one you were running from," he said softly. "I was younger then, away working a cattle drive. By the time I came back, she was married to a man who—" He paused, pain evident in his face. "He hurt her badly. She didn't survive the first year." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm so sorry." His fingers tightened around hers. "I couldn't help her then, but I can help you now." "You already have," she whispered. "More than you know." They sat like that, hands clasped across the table, for several long moments. Something was changing between them, something neither of them had expected. The next morning they set out before dawn, Brody's horse carrying their essential supplies. Eleanor wore trousers borrowed from Brody, rolled up and belted tightly at the waist, allowing her to ride more comfortably. Their journey took them deeper into the mountains, through passes where the snow still lingered despite the late spring. Brody was a patient teacher, showing Eleanor how to read the terrain, identify edible plants, and move silently through the forest. At night, they would make camp in sheltered spots, sleeping close to each other for warmth. Each day, the initial awkwardness between them faded further, replaced by a growing comfort and trust. On the fifth night of their journey, as they sat beside their small fire in a sheltered grove, Brody handed Eleanor a book he had packed, a collection of Tennyson's poetry. "I thought you might like this," he said. "It was my sister's favorite." Eleanor took the book carefully, touched by the gesture. "Would you read some to me?" In the flickering firelight, Brody's voice was rich and deep as he read the familiar verses. Eleanor watched his face, the way the firelight caught in his eyes, and felt something unfurl in her heart. When he finished reading, she found herself leaning closer to him. "Brody," she said softly, "I'm glad it was you who found me that day." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "So am I." The distance between them seemed to shrink, an invisible pull drawing them together. When his lips finally met hers, it felt like coming home. His kiss was gentle at first, questioning, then deeper as she responded. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brody rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he whispered. "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted. "But I'm not running from it." They continued their journey the next day, the air between them charged with new awareness. Their touches lingered longer, their glances held more meaning. By the time they reached the California border, Eleanor knew with certainty that her heart belonged to this quiet, strong man who had risked everything for her. 3 weeks after leaving Brody's cabin, they arrived at his friend's ranch near Sacramento. Marcus Jenkins, a gruff but kind-hearted rancher, welcomed them with open arms. "Any friend of Brody's is welcome here," he assured Eleanor. "You can stay as long as you need." That evening, as they sat on the porch of the guest cabin Marcus had given them, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Brody took Eleanor's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "about what happens next." Eleanor turned to him, her heart quickening. "What have you been thinking?" "I could build us a place, not far from here. Marcus has offered me work training horses for him." He paused, gathering courage. "But only if that's what you want to." Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand. "Is that a proposal, Brody Mitchell?" "I reckon it is," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I know it hasn't been long, but when you know, you know." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Yes to all of it." 2 months later, they were married in a simple ceremony on Marcus's ranch. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair. As they exchanged vows, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a terrified bride to be running across the desert to a woman who had found not just freedom, but love. That night, as they lay together in the small cabin they now shared, Brody traced gentle patterns on her skin. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Eleanor shook her head, her heart full. "Not one. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner," he replied, pulling her closer. 1 year later, they stood on the porch of their new home, a sturdy ranch house Brody had built with his own hands on land adjacent to Marcus's property. Eleanor cradled their newborn daughter, watching as Brody worked with a young colt in the corral. The horse was spirited but responding well to Brody's patient guidance. His reputation as a horse trainer had spread, bringing clients from as far as San Francisco. Eleanor had found her own place too, teaching at the small school in the nearby town. As if sensing her gaze, Brody looked up and smiled, that same smile that had warmed her heart from the beginning. He secured the colt and walked toward the house, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "How are my girls?" he asked, kissing Eleanor softly before gazing down at their sleeping daughter. "Perfect," Eleanor replied. "Just perfect," as the sun set over their land, painting the sky in familiar hues of gold and crimson. Eleanor thought about the desperate young woman who had fled across the desert that dawn so long ago. She had been searching for freedom, but she had found so much more. She had found home. Brody wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the day end and the first stars appear, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the western sky.